The story is set in the fictional kingdom of Shinra. The land was ruled by a benevolent queen and her husband King Jako. The queen possessed supernatural powers which were genetically passed down to her son Ageha and her daughter Tathia. Ageha and Tathia's abilities were subtle, but Cesare, the queen's youngest daughter, was devoid of these traits. Unfortunately, in the conquest of power, the children's gifts were exploited by the king and were experimented on by alchemists in secret. When this was discovered by the queen, she sealed herself away as emerald gems with the intention of cutting off the king's source of power. Meanwhile, the lead alchemist Hidoshi saw the error of his ways and escaped Shinra with Ageha and Tathia to raise them in a stable environment. During this stalled conflict, Jako's alchemist developed the ability to harness the queen's power through the gems and sent out scouts to seek and return his two children. As a consequence of Jako's constant focus on Ageha and Tathia's power, Cesare's jealousy grew and would do anything to obtain her father's attention. She joins the hunt as well in order to receive his approval. Eventually, Hidoshi was found and was executed right before Ageha and Tathia's very eyes. With their emotions running high, this traumatic event fully awakened their dormant abilities. The soldiers responsible for their role model's death were killed on sight by our protagonists, and their quest to end Jako's tyranny begins. At face value, it would be easy to make the assumption that Espgaluda is related to Esbraid. Spiritually, yes. However, there are a lot of differences. Mechanically, it seems similar. You have your standard shot, focus shot, and even the barrier attack that blocks projectiles until it's released to inflict big damage. But the biggest mechanical difference between the two games lies within one button, Kakusei mode. More on that shortly. Typical of shmups, both characters have their personal benefits. Ageha is quick and his laser deals a good amount of damage. Tathia, on the other hand, is slower but has a wider shot spread. You're greeted to your elder being slaughtered, and in a fit of rage, your character bursts into the air and the game officially starts. Not unlike Esbraid, where Yusuke's friend gets killed right off on the spot. Now, if you weren't paying attention to the tutorial after you selected your character, you're going to think, wow, for being the first stage, there sure are a lot of bullets. Yes, but that doesn't mean this is another difficult cave title. If anything, it's actually easier. You just need to utilize the previously mentioned Kakusei mode. Now, depending on your character, this makes them develop breasts or grow a cock. What? I'm not wrong. Does Espgaluda ever explain the purpose of this outside of its mechanical function? No. No, they don't. Other than the anime gender bend trope, this ability slows down bullets, which makes maneuvering easier, and if enemies are destroyed in this state, any bullets they produce prior to death are removed. This is called bullet canceling. When Kakusei mode is utilized, things really start falling into place. In fact, I was able to complete this stage without dying on my first attempt. In my time covering cave shmups, Espgaluda really made me appreciate bullet canceling in general. The player being rewarded for destroying enemies by removing the obstacles it created is a nice trade-off. And when it comes to shmups, I'll take all the help I can get. Destroying enemies in standard mode also drops gems. This not only serves for scoring purposes, but also refills your Kakusei gauge. As for the art design, I really need to re-evaluate the criticisms I gave Ketsui, mainly about samey enemies and bland backgrounds, because although Espgaluda is bright, I swear it's like they only had 5 colors to work with. Bright greens, golden enemies with pink and blue bullets. Oh, and gray. Gray backgrounds. I'm indifferent about the fantasy steampunk setting in general. I can't put my finger on it, but I feel like this aesthetic could have been fleshed out more. But I do like the designs of the bosses for the most part. Music-wise, this does not sound like Nemiki's work. I did find out that he was involved, but we can give most of the credit to So1. This is an alias the artist is referred by, which wasn't a relatively uncommon practice with game development in Japan. He's going for the techno beat route, and I believe most of the score is inoffensive. Not A tier, but at the very least, you may catch yourself bopping your head to the music. Getting back on track, eventually you'll face Cesare, all in her jealous rage. She'll throw some obstacles your way, but again, as long as you're actually utilizing Kakusei mode, that will increase your chances of survival. This stage's track stays consistent, quality-wise and thematically. Backgrounds are still bland, but on that note, it became clear to me that the muted backgrounds I've mentioned here and in Ketsui was an intentional design choice Cave adopted over time. The dulled backgrounds help contrast the bullet colors, giving it clear visibility. There's nothing more frustrating than taking a death when you don't know what killed you. Muted backgrounds may make the game less colorful, but it's an understandable compromise. Despite this, out of the 3 IGS Cave titles that adopted this practice, I think DOJ's aesthetic aesthetic worked with this practical design choice to the point that I never noticed it, because if you look back, the backgrounds are muted there as well. But to get back on track, I'm also noticing how well paced the difficulty ramps up, not just from stage to stage, but even in the level itself. The mid-bosses feel like a warranted skill check to make sure you're ready for the challenges to come. Eventually, I reach the stage boss Siren, and he dishes out interesting bullet patterns. Some of them are not as scary as they look. At some point in the fight, I did take a hit, yet despite that, I felt a glimmer of insight. Perhaps it was even inspiration. My thought was that anyone trying to get better at this genre use low-latency emulators and save states. If there's a moment that consistently crushes you, you save at that segment and consistently practice that part until you've mastered it. Then continue until you hit the next wall. I know I could use this method with really any shmup, but this felt especially achievable with Espgaluda. To clarify, so far, this game feels pretty approachable, to the point where I felt that it would actually be possible to one-credit this game if I really sat down and practiced. In Stage 3 fashion, your skills will indeed be checked, but again, the rising difficulty progression has been notably fluid. Eventually you'll come across these trains, and if you don't deal with them soon, the screen will quickly be overloaded with obstacles. As long as you're paying attention and understand the basic controls, Espgaluda is very good at giving you signs when to use Kakusei mode for bullet canceling purposes. I think that's called good game design. Oh, here's a tip for you guys. There's a secret extend at the end of this airship portion on the stage. If you're in Kakusei mode and attack this orb, you're rewarded with an extra life. Hey now, that's pretty cool. Eventually you fight the stage boss Amaranth, and the patterns are fun to avoid, but man, I just wish these bosses didn't share the same color palette as minor enemies. Regular enemy, grayish with a strip of gold. Bosses, grayish with a strip of gold, but big. Calling it right now. Best track in this entire OST. In fact, So1 knows it too. He stated before in interviews that this is a fan favorite. You could say it's a little repetitive, but a bop's a bop. The difficulty continues to escalate, and the mid-boss will smack you around a bit. But I do know I'm dying less frequently than I have in prior Cave titles. When you face a Stage 4 boss, it will separate itself during the fight. And this is when I realized that most of the boss fights use some kind of extension or appendage during these battles. And for me personally, I think that gives Espgaluda a unique spin compared to other shmup titles. Oh wow, they're really hammering the homages now. This cityscape is very similar to the final stage of Espgaluda, just with a green tint, because of course it's green. Everything in this game is green. Eventually you'll reach Cesare for a rematch, and I was really enjoying this fight, but as you see here, as soon as I was getting used to the pattern, she switched it up and I took a hit. After that fight is squared off, we get another Espgaluda reference bomb. As soon as you enter the building, you'll be hit with dai-ou-jou. Espgaluda simulates the Psychic Girl Genocide segment in Espgaluda. The girl's bullet patterns are pretty scattered, or at least I struggled with avoiding these, so instinctually I used Kakusei bullet cancels when I could. Eventually you'll face the cream of the crop, King Jakko. I actually ended up surprising myself because I was able to knock out 75% of his health before getting hit. That was cool until I realized this was his first phase. He switches up the bullet patterns with each phase shift, but you haven't seen anything yet until you've reached his desperation phase. He unleashes a massive, screen-filled, stitched blanket of bullets, and you have very little wiggle room to evade this attack. There clearly has to be a strategy to survive this consistent attack, but I'm not sure what that is. If that wasn't bad enough, your barrier attack heals him instead of damages him. You have to rely on raw knowledge of this game to properly survive this segment. Throughout this process, I noted how the difficulty progression in Espgaluda was very fine-tuned, but this might have been thrown out the door with this battle. This fight is definitely a skill check, but that might be expected, considering this is the final boss. After multiple deaths and a consistent stream of credits, King Jakko is defeated, and you're treated to a quick, albeit vague cutscene, not unlike Espgaluda. And that's the end of the game. Game over! I came into Espgaluda with a relatively clean slate. I was more aware of its sequel due to the legendary status of the Cave 360 ports, and assumed that Espgaluda 2 was the superior game. As it turns out, that may not be the case. Fans gravitate towards the first one more. Main reason being, it just feels better to play, mainly due to its straightforward game design. Even during my rundown, I noted that if I was going to 1cc a shmup, Espgaluda gave me a real hope of actually achieving that, and it turns out this was Cave's intention. According to Cave's sales department, they strongly advised the dev team not to make another game like Ketsui. and it isn't hard to see why this was suggested. Ketsui didn't perform well in arcades because players at the time felt like it was a difficult, prototypical shmup. Tsuneki Ikeda states in a March 2010 issue of Arcadia magazine, Shikigami no Shiro hit the arcades, and operators were once again requesting STGs with human characters. If we were going to do that, we wanted to try adding something new to that mix, and Espgaluda was the result. So with the combination of toning down the difficulty, hiring Tsukasa Kado as the art designer to give the game a modern anime aesthetic, and acquiring So 1 for an upbeat score, Espgaluda did succeed in gaining a following. Sure, it's easier than previous Cave titles, but that doesn't mean you can breeze right through it. It's still Cave after all. I would argue that even for hardcore players, there's ways to ramp it up. Just use Kakusei Overdrive mode. Now, I haven't mentioned this up until now, but this mode activates when your Kakusei gauge is empty. The consequence of this is that enemy bullets will become extremely fast and will continue to get faster the longer you're in this state. This isn't without its perks. If you're in overmode long enough, maxing out at level 4, enemies will drop more gems when you revert to normal Kakusei mode. This is actually a nifty mechanic because it serves the dual purpose of increasing your score and allowing you to use Kakusei mode more frequently since gems refill your Kakusei gauge. With all this being said, there's a reason I enjoyed my playthroughs of Espgaluda. Its tight design makes it feel fair but challenging, while retaining the true purpose of a game, being fun. I'm not in love with the character art style, but it's not awful and it's easy to overlook if you share my sentiments. Sharing the same fate of the dai-ou-jou PlayStation 2 port, Espgaluda's port was also handled by Arika, so as you can expect, it's a damn good one. But to achieve that level of arcade accuracy wasn't an easy task. Ichiro Mihara, vice president of Arika, expands on this process on a now defunct Japanese blog website. Replicating the feel of arcade PCB's slowdown for the PS2 port was extremely difficult. We were able to find a relatively clear solution for the enemies and enemy bullet slowdown, but for Ageha and Tathia, replicating the internal processor slowdown was a huge problem, and we had to make many meticulous, small adjustments to fine-tune it. Now, this port shares similar modes as its dai-ou-jou counterpart, except it lacks a Death Label boss rush mode. But according to Mihara, this was the intention, given that Espgaluda isn't known for brutal difficulty like dai-ou-jou is. Instead, it was replaced with an arrange mode. Stages are the same, but the experience is pretty different. For starters, the original characters are replaced by two suspiciously familiar figures, Black and Chihiro, who look and play like JB Fifth and Iori from S-Braid. Secondly, the enemies are more hostile, and thirdly, the soundtrack was remixed by Shinji Hosoe. I see this as another solution to hardcore players who wish that Espgaluda was more demanding. And just like the dai-ou-jou port, this package also comes with a bonus DVD of arcade super plays. Overall, solid port with fun and helpful extras. I believe this game is region locked, and as of this recording, the price seems to hover between $70 and $90. I had a good time with Espgaluda. It's probably the most balanced shmup I've played so far in the series. As of right now, your only options of playing this title is the region-locked PlayStation 2 port, emulation, the PGM conversion cart, or the official PCB. The last option, obviously, not being a personal recommendation, unless you're a die-hard fan that can drop damn near $2,000 in one setting. From my perspective, Ketsui was inadvertently a send-off to realistic hardcore shooters, and after the relative success of Espgaluda, its design philosophies would mostly be adapted to future titles. But at this point, the PGM hardware was starting to show its age, so if Cade wants to implement these contemporary design practices, maybe they need new hardware to really show everyone what they're made of. Thanks for watching, guys. Shout out to Mexi50Cal for being part of the contributor tier on my Patreon. If you like my content, feel free to check out my Patreon. Anyway, guys, take care and have an excellent week. Bye-bye.